So if someone can just answer a call on a mobile phone, you may be able to easily collect data. The one thing that I want to say is that, in closing, is the importance of the data that we collect from beneficiaries and how it can create changes in our organization. And to give a particular example, in our organization, for 8 years, we operated in 2 locations in Cambodia, in the capital in Phnom Penh and in a secondary city called Battambang. And 2 years ago, we made a very, very difficult decision to consolidate those operations in Phnom Penh. And we did it in part because of cost pressures of how could we operate more profitably as a business. But in making the decision, we also looked at our impact data. We looked at the years of the data that we had collected about how our beneficiaries were increasing their income. And our beneficiaries, what was interesting is that our beneficiaries in both locations came from all over the country. They weren't just from Phnom Penh or from Battambang. And what we saw is that the outcomes in terms of their increases in incomes were much higher in Phnom Penh. And we think it was in part because of the quality of education. We think it was in part because of the job opportunities there. But it was incontrovertible that we were having better outcomes there. And based on that data, we were able to then make a really tough decision that we're going to close down this operation that we had invested in. We had a lot of ties to the local community. We were going to transfer almost all of our staff to the office in Phnom Penh and do that. And we used the data that we had collected over the years to make that decision.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like a very nice story to end this session on. Now, we're going to have a couple of quick closing remarks, but once again, I asked you a question at the beginning, how many of you were convinced about the value added of feedback loops? Could you raise your hand now just to indicate quickly whether you are still...
The less.
So we've had one hand, 2 maybe, 3 at a push. That's, well done guys, that's good work. That wasn't part of the plan. Okay, well, at the beginning, I kind of raised three broad issues that I thought we would cover, and I think we have. So we've rather too well. I think we've covered the challenges of feedback data. We've seemed to have covered that really pretty well indeed. But what I also wanted to get across, and perhaps maybe the next couple of days will allow this, is that these can be overcome, and I don't think we should lose sight of the value that we can get from using feedback data. The second thing that we wanted to talk a bit about was how the data is used, how it's made sense of, and how it comes into the organization. And I think we've seen that it's really important, and that feedback data on itself isn't that valuable. It's what happens to it in the organization that makes it really add value to the work that we do. And third, we've explored the tip of the iceberg about some of the system level changes or some of the system level discussions that need to happen. And I think the next couple of days will be your opportunity to continue these. Now, I think it's worth noting that the starting point for beneficiary feedback, investee feedback, is not the end point. So there is a process that you need to go through. And I think we, as a sector here, are where the customer satisfaction world was a number of years ago. So there's lessons to be learned there, and I think we're moving in the right direction. And as you have your final discussions in the next couple of days, I'd like to leave you with 3 thoughts. The first is that feedback data is strongly linked to outcomes, as I think our discussion has shown. That makes feedback data very important as part of your impact measurement. Moreover, I would suggest that feedback data can be a predictive indicator of outcomes. Now, as a result, and this is the second point, the key to using feedback data, in my opinion, is light touch regular feedback. So that you can use it for course correction, so that you can manage to your impacts. Now, the last point, and we've talked a bit about this and had a couple of questions on it, is closing the loop. It's really important to move beyond the extractive data process and engage with your investees, your beneficiaries, your clients, and to have that open and honest and frank discussion. And that is how, I think, as an organization, you create the culture of beneficiary feedback. And perhaps if we can, in the next couple of days or 2, have similar open and frank discussions, we'll be moving as a sector towards using beneficiary feedback and investee feedback. So all that's left for me to do is to ask you to join me in thanking our panel. They'll be here for the next couple of days. Make use of it.
And our moderator.
end of the spectrum, and nobody believes the total end of the spectrum that ignore the money and just believe either, right? And so we've gotten to a more nuanced discussion. And so I put probably some horribly inaccurate kind of descriptors of sort of how we're going to address this. You can jump to the next slide real quick. So this slide, these guys haven't even seen it, so can you see it? This slide, it's sort of in my kind of trying to figure out after we had a conversation about what everybody had to say. These are kind of the areas where I think we have productive disagreement in the field that I find to be really exciting. And so how you set your priorities and how you set your priorities as a business or as an investor are really interesting and will change who you are and how you behave. And then these are the kinds of questions that I'm really interested in being answered by the end. And so if our comments don't do it, let's push them up to the panelists. So next slide, please. We will start with Rhett Morris of Endeavor.
Excellent. It is really exciting to be with all of you guys here today. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what Endeavor does. At Endeavor, we are working to lead the high-impact entrepreneurship movement around the world. The primary way that we do that is we identify and select the most high-potential entrepreneurs that we can find in the 15 countries where we work into our network. Each year we take in about 100 companies, and we provide them with a host of services, primarily mentorship, training, things like that, to enable them to scale faster and increase their growth and ultimately have a really large impact in the economies and the countries where they work. We are agnostic in our selection process as to whether or not the companies we work with have some sort of additional social impact other than creating high quality jobs, such as like having a double bottom line. What that means is roughly 10 to 20% of the companies that we have selected and that we've worked with do have some sort of social impact that they measure and that is incorporated in their mission. And we're talking about a challenge that we noticed that led to some research, that led to some discussion, and that we were really excited by. Before I get into that, I do want to thank two people who are here. Amisha Miller, who's a colleague of mine who leads all the great research work that we do in Brazil, and who's been a really valued thought partner with what we do. And then Erin Behringer, who is in the blue and who won't raise her hand because she's humble, and who actually was very closely involved with this specific piece of research I'm going to tell you about, and deserves a huge amount of credit for it. So what we found with Endeavor is as we were looking at the entrepreneurs and the companies that they ran that had some social impact component that was a part of their mission that they were measuring, we noticed that the results of them tended to either be really, really great in terms of scaling or really, really terrible. And so we said, what can we do to figure out what's driving the difference in these results? Because some of the terrible ones were like in the bottom decile of Endeavor, and some of the best ones were among the top 20 fastest growing companies in our network. And those companies actually provide a huge amount of, if you look at the distribution of our impact, they're incredibly important to us. And so for our internal needs, we want to understand how can we select more of the good ones and less of the bad ones, because Endeavor itself is a social enterprise, and we're trying to create lots of high quality jobs around the world and economic growth and things like that, or facilitate those things. So we analyzed all of our internal data. Nothing really popped between the two different groups. So we went through a series of interviews, and we started to notice some differences that related to how these entrepreneurs thought about scale. And the first thing I'll say about scale is it's what we wrote the original article about that kind of led to this. I don't want anyone to think that at Endeavor we think that all social problems must have scalable solutions, because there are some problems that probably can't be solved in scalable ways because of the nature of them. But most of us, when we're thinking about engaging with for-profit entities to solve social problems, we're thinking about scale. And we were actually asked to write an article about scale. And so if we're thinking about scale, we want to understand what was driving the differences. So I'll tell you two stories about entrepreneurs that illustrate kind of what we saw. So the first is an entrepreneur named Roberta. And Roberta works in the healthcare space, and she is very passionate about reducing cost to provide more healthcare and better quality healthcare to people in her country, in Latin America. And she is among, I think, the top 10 or 15 fastest growing entrepreneurs in our network when we looked at the previous 3 years. There was another entrepreneur named Adam in Asia. Adam had a model where he was working with a disadvantaged population, providing them with jobs and training and things like that. Very, very passionate about the impact that he saw and the benefits of for-profit model. Over time, though, his impact, both in terms of financial metrics or social metrics, had declined. He now employed fewer people that were part of that population than when he started working with us at Endeavor, and his revenues had been going down at kind of a similar rate. So we wanted to understand why this was going on. When we talked to these entrepreneurs and others, we found there was a key difference, and that difference can be explained in this chart. So this is what we call the ease of scaling social enterprises matrix. The editors kind of abbreviated it a little bit for us, but basically we found that two things among the entrepreneurs that we worked with drove the difference in the result of scaling financial and social impact. The first is, I'd actually start at the bottom, the business model structure. We talked to some of our friends in the academic community, Michael Chu at Harvard, Kathy Clark at Case at Duke, and they did a lot of thinking on this and really helped us understand that what Kathy talks about is friction in your business model in terms of your social goals and your financial goals, and how often those are opposed to each other. And what she kind of pointed out that we saw very often was when those were aligned, the example we saw with Roberta, her model was providing an IT solution to reduce healthcare costs. So the more she sold that solution into hospitals, the greater her impact was, because the more hospitals she was in, the more she reduced healthcare costs across the system, and helped to change the healthcare landscape of her country. When we think about Adam, his goals were a little bit less aligned, because if he wanted to provide more training or better pay to his workers, that started eating into his profit margins. He was very focused, or he is very focused on a specific group of people in one geographic area. His desire to scale to other disadvantaged groups is very low. So some of his social goals kind of conflicted with the financial goals that related to the health of his company. The second thing we talked to them about was their motivation, how they thought about making trade-offs, because when you have two sets of goals, you have to make trade-offs sometimes. And what we found was when we talked about motivations and said, how do you deal with trade-offs, the entrepreneurs who said, maybe not all the time, but if I have to make a trade-off, I'm going to tend to favor the financial goals of the company. And a lot of times what they said was in part because if we're not in business, we're not helping anybody, because we're a for-profit organization. Those entrepreneurs also tended to scale much faster. And so we put those two things together on this matrix because I'm a recovering consultant and I have to think in 2x2s. And what we found was, and I'd say the bottom's probably most important. When your business model has less friction and fewer trade-offs are required or encountered, it's pretty easy to scale. And then as you would deal with the trade-offs that do sometimes arise, favoring the financial goals, not all the time, but having a slight bias, probably enables you to scale a little bit faster, based on what we saw. So that's what we learned, and that led us to say, all right, we want to put a stake in the ground, and our stake in the ground is this. If you are trying to tackle a social problem, and you want to do it in a scalable way, with a for-profit solution like the companies that we've been engaging with, we think that making sure that you are putting your financial goals at the very top of your consideration, so much so that you're trying to align sometimes your social goals to your financial goals, and when you encounter trade-offs that when you have to make a choice that you're going to slightly favor the financial goals, at least over the social goals, is going to enable you to scale faster. And Tom's going to tell you why he thinks I'm wrong.
So let me go back real quick. And so Endeavor wants high impact entrepreneurs to scale, and if that happens across your portfolio, then Endeavor sees themselves as successful.
Right, because we're creating high-quality jobs in countries where there's a huge jobs crisis. We did some work with ANDE on this last year. And in addition to places where there may not even be that much unemployment, we're also helping keep middle-class jobs
Got
in
it.
the countries, right? We're trying to reduce brain
So
drain as well.
it is that scale is your goal. So the scale is the given here. You want them to scale. And whether or not they're impactful within the scope of the size of their organization is a totally different question.
Yes, but for this
Okay.
research, this is only relevant to the entrepreneurs that we work with that do
Right.
have a double bottom line or some social component to their mission.
Okay.
So this research was only to kind of that 10 to 20% of the entrepreneurs that we work with.
That have identified themselves
That
as having a social
self-identify as social.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
Can you just define high-quality job?
really, we're going to
Well-
go there now?
I'm sorry, but we just did a whole session on it. Genevieve, she should have been there.
Let's table that one because it's a great question.
Okay.
But Tom, why is Rhett full of it? No.
I don't think Rhett is full of it at all. And listening to Rhett talk, I agree with the lion's share of what he says. What the actual blog that I was responding to had some language in it that strikes a particular nerve, perhaps, with Acumen. Which
I have that
is,
nerve too, yeah.
Which is in the midst of so much of a debate, which is about this space called impact investing, and whether you're impact first or finance first. And people tend to jump on things like, if there are trade-offs between the social and the finance,
Yep.
maximize the finance as carte blanche to say finance is all that's important, and that's all we should be looking at. And we, through our experience, actually feel that if you want to create impact through impact investing, we don't know enough about the impact that impact investing causes. And impact is such a complicated thing that requires so much knowledge and of the people that are receiving the goods and services that are provided, that we can't say that just scaling finance is all that's going to happen. Not every good and service is perfect for the poor. Not every good and service doesn't need tweaking. Not every good and service is ready to just scale.
Yep.
We actually need to start looking more at how these goods and services are consumed and what impacts they have before we can say things as fundamentally as I think it was portrayed in that particular blog. So what it talks to is an issue that I think is this big tug of war in impact investing, which is that
Well done. Nice
you've got people saying we're impact first, and people saying we're finance first. And I was at a conference the other day, and someone said, with all due respect, which we all know means none whatsoever, you're an impact first impact investor. And I went away thinking, oh, okay, I didn't know that was a problem. But and so we've got this big problem of this if we keep clicking through, of aid in the market and what is impact investing, and it occupies this space between aid in the market, and people are very excited about it, particularly in places that I just came from, DFID, that this is a space that impact investing can bring aid, allow aid to start having all the incentives and operation of markets and be more efficient in the way it delivers for goods and services and creates jobs for poor people. And so people get very excited about it. But I still think there's this big question about what it is and what this debate is and why there's nerves about statements about maximise finance first. And if we keep going through, and we could think about some of the reason I think this is we think about some of the experience of microfinance. And microfinance is arguably something that is we have seen, though going back to its origins in 1970s, it started with aid subsidy that supported 30 or so women, I think, in the weaving industry. And since then, Grameen Bank has had 30 billion worth of subsidy over that period of time in order to get microfinance to start to look like a market investable product. And you start to see Citibank and Standard Chartered and CDC and others and big pension funds in the Netherlands invest in microfinance, and it has focused on going to scale, and that finance is, you put finance first, and then microfinance can become this market-friendly, investable sector. I say it with one caveat, though, that actually it's come under recent criticism because we started to look at some indicators that were largely about the financial performance of microfinance, the return rates of microfinance, and didn't look necessarily at was it reaching the people that it meant to. And reaching the poorest may involve some trade-offs, which means that you might cross-subsidize or or work harder to get to the poorest because you're mission driven, and that may create more impact even if you're serving fewer people. So with that caveat, but moving on, we've got this space called impact investing full of all these things that people have invested in, and we don't fully understand what they are. We know, if we keep scrolling through, and these could be a whole load of things like solar lighting, mobile authentication, sanitation, low-income housing. And some of these, I would argue, are the sorts of products that you can just maximize the finance of, that with the slight caveat on microfinance, which ends up near the market of targeting the poor, some of these are the sorts of things that are products that actually you can are probably going to work in these markets. You can probably just seek to be as financially effective as you can as a business running these, and you'll get to poor people and create impact. And so we see that some of them will scroll to be at the market side, but there are a whole load of things that are really, really difficult to supply that actually we don't know an awful lot about how the poor consume low-income housing in places like Pakistan. And we know that in places like the UK, low-income housing is not provided by service providers who just maximize finance. They make trade-offs about the number of housing units they can provide because of the amount of subsidy they get from government versus how many people they want to serve and the sorts of people they want to serve, whether it's people in transition housing, in fragile situations. They can serve fewer of those because it's more expensive, because the voids come round quicker. So we see actually in the countries that we work in, a lot of these products that people are talking about impact investing going into have real trade-offs, and people are effectively choosing to not maximize finance but try to maximize social return because they're mission driven. So we start to see, hopefully, we may start to see in time a market that starts to develop where some of these products are exactly as Rhett described, the sorts of things we should be maximizing finance, and other products in this space that we call impact investing require more patience, potentially more subsidy from aid, and are going to be more difficult, and we shouldn't leap to concluding that they are ready products to scale financially straight away. And what I would hope is that then once we start to understand that a bit better and be a bit cautious about the conclusions we reach, we see this model of impact investing, and over time it starts to look like a sector where we understand which products there may be trade-offs, and we trade off and maximize the social returns, of which we can just really work with companies that we can maximize the financial returns, and we start to see them closer to the market. So impact investing, and I guess this presentation is more like, what is impact investing anyway, is not, it's the next slide, sorry, not an inexorable march to markets alone, but instead is where markets do and don't work to solve social problems, and we think carefully about when we invest and how we invest and who can invest best to do that. And that means that the space shouldn't have a tug of war, but hopefully we start to see people where we say, yeah, we really think that what you said is right for certain companies and certain times, but there are other really challenging companies, really challenging goods and services to get to the poor, that we have to make trade-offs, and sometimes we should make trade-offs that involve putting the social ahead of the finance.
Cool. So,
sorry, let's get through.
So, but I always thought subsidy is bad, and the end goal is market return, market rate, right?
I don't think subsidy is bad, and we see that in a lot of, all the countries a lot of, in the UK, lots of goods and services, because the poor can't consume these, is delivered effectively by markets like energy. You still see subsidies either directly to the companies or to the recipients to allow them to consume those goods. And we should continue to think that they would play a role in the countries that we're working in, when I'm working in acumen in developing countries, that subsidy plays an important role in making sure that goods and services can get to the poorest.
There you go. Okay, thank you, Tom. Allison, so dealing with the role of the beneficiary and paying attention to that person's agency, their ownership. Tell us about that in Grassroots Business Fund.
Sure. And I wasn't a part of this wonderful blog battle, but I got to sneak in here anyway. Because I wanted to, I wanted to share another perspective. I think if we're thinking about what impact is and how we can maximize it, we have to think a lot about the role that people living at the base of the pyramid play and how we engage them and how we're accountable to them. So different ANDE members have different missions as it relates to poverty alleviation. For some of us, it's more direct. For others, it's more indirect, trying to grow markets in general. But it's a part of ANDE's hypothesis that small and growing businesses will contribute to poverty alleviation, hopefully. So while we've seen that economic growth in general is important for poverty alleviation, we've also seen that the distribution of that growth is really important, which is why I think we need to think a lot about the role that people with very low incomes play in our work and in the businesses we support. So here I offer just a way that we can start to think about this through our investment decisions, through our capacity building. So feedback and accountability loops were covered a lot in the session earlier today, which was great. And in particular, when those feedback loops are getting to people living at the base of the pyramid, and that feedback is actually being incorporated into the business. So if a company is selling a product, then having that product be developed in partnership with its intended consumers. Things like after-sales service. There are some stories not talked about enough of products being sold to people living at the base of the pyramid, and a few months later they don't work, and there's no recourse for that. So this is important not just for enhancing the positive potential impact, but also avoiding the harm that can be done when there's not real accountability built into the business models. Those are for businesses who are aiming to make impact through the product or service they're selling, but if the intended impact is through a job or an economic opportunity, Grassroots Business Fund has supported some of our investees in doing surveys with their smallholder farmer suppliers in several instances. And we've found, in some cases, really positive feedback. In some cases, we learned about particular trainings that farmers would really appreciate, and companies were able to then provide that training. And in some cases, we found not so rosy information, like some payments were being made late. And so that, we listened in that case, and that led GBF to also play an active role making sure that was figured out, that was solved. So going a step kind of deeper into the engagement and accountability, actually it's all on that one slide, is leadership development. So how can we invest in the capacity of people living at the base of the pyramid in a way that will live on past the life of our investment? So this might look like supporting cooperatives or producer groups. And one example in Grassroots Business Fund's portfolio is a company called Industry in India that's not just providing an economic opportunity for artisans, but it has helped to organize them into self-help groups first, and more recently into producer groups. So providing training in financial management and production techniques. So those artisan groups will be able to own their means of production and to supply to companies even in addition to industry. So that's, we think, even more catalytic than the alternative of simply providing a kind of lower income job. And then the most engaged and accountable I think that we can get, and I think we should think more about as a sector, is investing in companies that are actually co-owned and managed by people living at the base of the pyramid. So many of us have heard of the example of Divine Chocolate, which is about 50% owned by its suppliers in Ghana, and they have 2 seats on the company's board. But in this case, and is Working World an ANDE member? It's a company, an impact investor in New York. We should get them in here. that invests all in cooperatives around the world. And so the reason I bring this up is because this is building assets and capacity among low-income communities in a way that I think more deeply addresses the issue and question of poverty alleviation, because that is still broadly something that we're hoping to get to as a sector.
So how do you count that? How do you know that you have done this thing?
Mike and I were talking in a session earlier today about how you can have a company that got these output metrics: 5,000 farmers, 1.5 million in a year. Scenario A, they do all these wonderful things and go above and beyond. Mm-hmm. Scenario B, they make late payments and their working conditions are horrible. So I think counting it is important. You can look at things like ownership and but I guess the issue is some of it doesn't boil down to a number. It's more about the policies and practices and ownership of the company. So yeah, I think we have to get a little bit more nuanced.
So in your case, it's an investment filter. You are looking to work with invest in companies that are going to create that kind of ownership.
Yeah, it's both an investment filter and a way that we look at the sorts of capacity building that we'll do with a company after an investment is made.
Interesting. Okay, so let's go to that questions slide real quick. Next one, the last one, I repeated it, there it is. So looking across these issues, the ones that are priorities map roughly to the chairs here. And the questions, I think the one that maybe is really interesting to start with, and I'm not going to ask them all explicitly, but is this idea, as impact investors, how do you know if you're successful? So we've gotten past the stage of because I gave away my money, and I think we've also got past the stage of I'm not because I didn't get market return. So how do you know if you are any good at your jobs? How does your organization know if they're any good?
I went first last time. I'm trying to,
You have to call on us.
yeah.
So it's a work in progress. The first part of Acumen's work to find out whether we were any good was answering this question about scale. That's why I think I've got so much in common with and really think Rhett's position is a good, a really solid first building block, and maybe right most of the time, but just not all of the time. And Acumen's first approach to do this was to talk about scale, was to test whether or not companies could be supported through this period where it's really hard to get going, and could they come out the other end and produce products that impacted millions of lives. And that's really hard to get going when there's very little architecture, and you need to build and work with the ANDEs and the GINs of this world to start putting an iris and pulse and putting those things together to ask those questions is a long slog.
So just like with Endeavor, you have scale built into your idea of success.
And that is the first question that we needed to ask. And now we're going to ask a second question that I think is really challenging, and some of the things that Alison's talking about, that we don't think you can stop at that, even though
at scale.
At scale, even though we know that there are companies in our portfolio that have gone to scale. That's not enough to know whether or not they have, as poverty alleviation agents, they have contributed to poverty alleviation. So how do you know if you're successful? We can say we're successful at scale. That's really important because more scale, all things being equal, is more impact. But we can't yet.
That's his point. So you need to know. You need your own point now.
Yeah, but we can't yet say that is all that we know. That each compare a company that's produced less scale to a company that's produced more scale, and say which has created more impact. And we can't do that just yet. But we can work on some of the exciting tools like the Progress Poverty Index, like TaraWorks, which I think is, you're talking to me again about Steve today, really exciting tools that allow us to cost effectively tell us more about the impact we're making and move us closer to that. If, this may be a controversial point, but I feel like when it's what is impact anyway, where impact investing has got to thus far is great architecture to tell us about scale and outputs. And in 3 or 4 years' time, we need to be at great architecture to tell us about correlation between investments and outcomes. And in further time than that, we need great architecture, cost-effective architecture to tell us about impact. And that's the road. So we can say only so much about impact thus far.
I don't know if we'll ever get to the second one, but I agree on the first. So for both of you guys, and then we'll open it up to the audience, how tight is the relationship between the success of your investees' companies equals or aggregates to the success of your organization?
Well, I think for us, it's closely related. And I actually really liked one of the things that you shared with us. And if you could go back to the slide where he had aid in markets, and then he had like the industries, one more back or two more back, right there. I think this picture intuitively to me makes a lot of sense. And I think that when we think about success, it's not just success of individual organizations like Endeavor. I think we can talk more broadly about success of our entire sector. And so much change has happened in the last 15 years. So many of our organizations are maybe 15 years old, about or younger. And one of the ways I would define success for us as a sector is we are becoming more intelligent about what works and what doesn't work for social enterprise. And I see something like this, and I say, plus or minus, I agree with the way that Tom has split things out for solar lighting and low-income housing and sanitation. When we came up with this matrix, the first organization that popped in my mind wasn't an Endeavor firm, it was D-Light. Because I was like, oh, this is like D-Light's the perfect example of why, combining these two things together, aligning your social impact strategy with your financial strategy, just turns scale right on, and there it is. What I would say is perhaps, we're in a situation where maybe some of these industries are developing, and whether it's social impact industries or completely different industries, sometimes developing industries need subsidies, right, to develop. We can think of all sorts of things in technology that needed that, right? Mm. Other times, at a certain point, you have to pull back and you say, you know what? This model doesn't work. The social enterprise model may not be the best model to address drinking water, sanitation, low-income housing, and primary health care. And I think as a group, we don't have the answer to that yet. But I think that we have to be comfortable saying that could be true, because we're forced to make these trade-offs. And if the trade-offs are so oppositional that we can't get to scale, why are we trying to use these for-profit mechanisms? Nonprofit or government-supported mechanisms may be the best way to solve certain problems. And I think when we get to the point where we can say, guess what? We didn't get it all right in our initial hypothesis. We've learned a lot as a sector, and we're going to cross a couple of these things off. Then we're going to be successful, because we'll have shown that, look, we learned something. That what we thought on day one wasn't completely true. We were honest with ourselves. We took data. We let that inform our decision. And now we're doing things differently. Mm-hmm. Because if not, we're fooling ourselves. Mm-hmm. Because we didn't know the answer on day one. We had to learn something.
So if I could answer the question about how would we know if we're having the impact that we're trying to have, I would say it's twofold for us. So one is when we're able to go beyond collecting output metrics and do some survey level research and actually understand have people's incomes increased over time? Is this a quality economic opportunity that's allowing people to grow their incomes? And the other element that GBF can control more closely is setting up the businesses to be strong businesses financially, but also socially and environmentally responsible. Because we leave after 7 years, and how do we ensure that the right mechanisms and capacity is in place? I think, and that again is hard to boil down to a couple numbers, but we think is really important in terms of knowing about whether or not impact is achieved.
So do you bring social values into your social values? That's a really loaded term, but we'll stick with it. Into your investees that would not have been there otherwise?
We bring We bring capacity around really illuminating what all of the local laws and regulations
Okay.
are. Oftentimes many things are okay. Other times it's sort of an educational experience, and because we can be a hands-on partner and working with companies on those issues, it's more. There's the ESG realm really blends closely with the business realm because
What's ESG?
Environment, social,
Thank
and governance. So, because as these small and growing businesses are formalizing, they need to meet they need to meet national standards at a very basic, at a minimum, and also it improves efficiency and supplier retention, consumer retention when these things are in place. So there's a lot of overlap between business and social.
How long do we have till?
Can I just clarify one thing?
5:30. Okay.
I'll just clarify
Yeah,
one thing.
please.
I don't think that Rhett and I were saying something different, but if you scroll on to the next, this one and how it moves, the key is that these two get closer. They don't always. They're not taking aid, and when you could say subsidy and government is not taking all of these things. There is a role for impact investing in some of these. It's just that these ones are closer to some of the services that might be better provided by a state if it was a well-functioning state, or not, or by a private enterprise which has subsidy involved in it, which has more patience in the capital that recognises that this company won't be able to maximise finance. Because it's targeting the very poorest, it won't get the returns that another company that was a solar lighting company that wasn't targeting the very poorest was going for, or maybe not solar lighting, a off-grid energy solution in somewhere really, really far away from markets. That because they chose to create more impact by servicing the hardest people to reach, the very poorest, they required more patience. They didn't get the returns.
And a definition of success could be the ability to exist over time.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
It continually providing the service, and that does without scaling potentially, but
Possibly
that is
if
a
they're
baseline
really,
for
if you
success.
Think about how otherwise you get very Benthamite about it, and then you wouldn't have certain social services that support disability or things like that, where you are not going to get. You should not scale by finances when you are with small groups like that. Otherwise, you decide not to treat them.
So I'd like to just clarify things, because I think it should be a debate. So I'm going to take a stronger position.
Please do.
And
Thank
stop
you.
talking
Thank
about
you.
where
Yeah.
you agree. Here's what I'll say. I'm comfortable saying that I think that those things on the left, drinking water, sanitation, low-income housing, primary health care, probably should not be solved by social enterprise. And when we think about things that involve small groups of people, say working with developmentally disabled adults, social enterprise is probably not the right mechanism to serve that need in that population. Only because I want to drive some difference, into this discussion instead of having a happy, because we're all social enterprise people. We like to agree, be happy. But
I appreciate that.
I think we need to be willing to say, sometimes our model is not going to work everywhere for everything.
Mike.
Like, how do you know which go on the left and which go on the right? What's the criteria?
The best thing I've got right now is the matrix that we looked at earlier, right? Where the alignment of the social goals and the financial goals are very close, social enterprise is a very effective and scalable solution. Where they're not close, social enterprises can't scale. If the solution's not scalable, why are we using a social enterprise? It should be a nonprofit or a government solution.
What about those cases where it's both? I mean, low-income housing would be a good example. Low-income housing is a good example of a field. Son.
Just pretend.
Okay. Low-income housing is a great example of a field where there are both for-profit and nonprofit and less than multiple profit providers. So, how do you decide which fields haven't quite hit that threshold where they could take off, but with a partnership between market rate and below market rate solutions? In other words, maybe there are fields where there does need to be a lot of below market rate investment because it's not ready yet, and then it could scale up.
Yeah, and it could be even within a certain field, right? That below a certain point, a social enterprise won't work because the people are too poor or the investment needed is too much. But maybe there's a middle ground for social enterprise that's between something that's totally market-based at the top and totally subsidized at the bottom. But I just think we shouldn't consider social enterprise to be the solution for the entire.
Yeah, I think
Please.
please, yeah.
Do you see how static do you see these categories? In other words, from the entrepreneur's perspective, which you work, are there areas that are not listed up there that should be, but just aren't on the fashionable, impact investing list of the major players out there? Are there industries that, if there was more below market rate investment, more for-profit investment would be really possible?
So I think that's a really broad question, and we could be here for a while. I think this is a useful frame to drive difference.
Yes.
I think ultimately it comes back to the matrix for the individual business.
Well,
It depends
yeah.
which customers you're targeting, where you are in the industry. I think if you can build a business model that's aligning your goals, social enterprise is a great solution. If you can't, doesn't matter what the industry is, I don't think social enterprise is the right way to solve that social problem.
I mean, ultimately, it'll come down to, can you do it, right? So there's some on the left and some on the right, but if somebody does one on the left sustainably over time and scales, well, then we'll move it to the right. So, picking and choosing isn't really the issue, I don't think. It's that there may be these two different types. Misha.
I have a question. I have a microphone. I have a question about...
It doesn't work, but go ahead, Jeff.
I have a question about impact from another point of view.
Please.
When we were here before, we heard from Paul Ridner, I think, about microfinance. And he was talking that the biggest impact of microfinance was that they actually saw a change in the ecosystem. So that poor people were receiving financial services that they wouldn't have been receiving otherwise, and that was a kind of surprise impact of microfinance. How much are you guys investing in those kind of ecosystem impacts? Like, is that something that we should all be thinking about a bit more than we are?
Definitely. I think that some of the investments that we make will become the next microfinance. So solar lighting may become the next microfinance. And actually, the whole point of this is that these ones that go here, and maybe some of those there have disturbed markets, and they'll be successful when they disturb markets and can scale. The key difference, I think, though, that where Rhett and I are here is that I think that there's great reasons for market forces to provide some of these on the left here effectively and efficiently, but because of who they serve, because of the willingness to pay, the capacity to pay, the many market failures that affect the way in which poor people can consume these, they have to be supported. So if you're an impact investor, you can't get the returns, the big returns, because these companies can't maximize their finance. So you should expect 2, 3, 4%, maybe break-even returns. There is a subsidy there. There is one clever tool that can maybe flip that round, which puts the subsidy, which is a development impact bond, and if you have that, then the people who are investing can still get great returns, but someone's got to pay there to allow that kind of finance into those sectors. And low-income housing is a great example because it is really well provided in the UK by social enterprises called housing associations, and they do it better because they specialise, they are quasi-market, they do raise capital from the finance from the capital markets, and they are really efficient at delivering housing, low-cost housing in the UK, and they are a great example of that middle ground.
I think the other thing we really have to challenge is this idea that there is this goal of market rate returns, right? Because the market rate is absurd. It doesn't, I think it's pretty well understood that financial infrastructure of the globe is not working right now. The goal here isn't for this to be just like that. And I think, Allison, it's your point really sort of drives this home for me is those, the reason why at that top end of the market there's massive returns, it's because there are no returns at the bottom end of the market. And that this idea of ownership and understanding how those returns can be equitably distributed is what's really interesting.
Well, I think one thing to point out there is sometimes I think we blur the lines when we say like market-based returns and a 2, 3, 4% or a break-even return. Because we talk in a way that is perhaps more hopeful than even reality is. Let's just be real. I think the truth, though, is let's talk about the real hard cases, the one where there's a negative return, where there isn't a profit, and you can't solve it. I think we need to be able to say, like, if you're not able to drive a model and make a profit, there is a type of organization that's designed for that. It's called a not-for-profit, and it's not a social enterprise that's driven off a for-profit model. And I think we need to own that a little bit more. Maybe not for industry categories, but for more of the things that we want to solve with market forces. If the business model's not aligned, I have a hard time saying how it's going to work.
Randall?
Steve, I just want to follow up on your question about what is market rate or not, and what do we compare ourselves to? Because if you look at venture capital in the United States over the past decade, it's been 0 or negative. So we're shooting for better than that. Right?
Yeah.
But there's this perception challenge out there. It says, oh yeah, that's below market rate, because this idea that in emerging markets, because it's an emerging market, you're supposed to get 30% returns. So I don't know what the right comparison set is, but I do know that it's hard out there because people think that that comparison set is something that's a lot higher return than they would expect to get in the other asset classes. So how do you deal with that? How do we as ANDE help set the right expectations for that?
It's a great question. Yeah.
And I think one of the things that needs to be done, and would be interested to hear from the panel, is transparency on the subsidies that are provided to this industry. Because I think that subsidy is needed, and I think part of what the challenge is that subsidy is provided across all of those business models, but not transparently. And I think the model that Grassroots Business Fund has is excellent, but they're providing market rate returns because, maybe in part, because they have a technical assistance facility that sits alongside of that. And I think that we, as ANDE members, that's a real place where we can provide transparency to this issue. But we'd love to hear your comments.
I would love to hear a good definition that we can all agree on what subsidy is. Because I think, is it negative 100% return? What is subsidy in our context? Because then we can talk about it.
Well, we're providing a subsidy because the investments are patient. They part of our investments expect you give it philanthropically, but it will be reinvested at a one-time return. You're expecting some of the companies to pay back, and not all of them. So it's not like a market loan, and therefore the difference in the rate of return is effectively the subsidy. And we also encourage them to try and find grants sometimes, and think that grants can play a role in some of these companies. And we were explicit about that in the work we did with Blueprint to Scale, to say this is the model that we think, this is the model, and Bain doing that work and looking at Acumen's portfolio was explicit to say these are the sorts of companies that are in this area that need this patient capital, that are in this pioneer gap, and therefore need this subsidy of subsidized capital for this period of time. Some of the companies in our investment are going to be these ones that perform really well, but we can't guarantee all of them because it's so hard to get so many of the goods and services to the poor. And these are indicative. These aren't necessarily where we are, and we may be, it's flipped around. We might learn that, and we don't know that. We all nod because they feel right, but we don't know that yet, with the exception of microfinance. But even that, with the caveat that we're seeing lots of people put their hand up and say it's not the poverty alleviation tool that it was hoped that it could be. It certainly is, at times, a fantastic poverty alleviation tool. At other times, it's just not.
I guess, am I misunderstanding something? Doesn't Endeavor receive philanthropic subsidy to do your work?
We do receive philanthropic subsidy, and we're totally transparent about that. And we are a not-for-profit, and that's how our model works. We're building in some for-profit aspects. So our entrepreneurs now contribute membership fees. And once an office gets to scale, the selection and services processes of that office are covered by the dues that come directly from the entrepreneurs. And philanthropic capital goes to some of the overhead, but then some outreach and marketing activities. So we have something of a blended model where we're using different mechanisms for funding sources. I think this is specifically talking about for-profit solutions to certain problems.
But again, I think to the previous point, it's important to have transparency across the conversation. It doesn't make sense to me that we talk about just the philanthropic and the underwriting of the funds, and we don't say that, well, actually, if you're a venture capitalist and you write off 8 out of 10 deals that go south, and there's only 1 or 2 that actually, quote, make back your money, but you're basically subsidizing the 8 failures for 5 to 10 years of a legacy investment during the period which you're claiming that this is a for-profit model. I get confused in terms of the language that people on both sides of the conversation use, because I think it's all replete with subsidy across, and it's simply a question of capital structure. It's not. I think the whole risk-return thing is it's a red herring. I think we get sucked into a stupid conversation that not that this conversation itself.
Thank you, Jeff.
It's just not the point, right? I mean, the point is how we understand performance and capital and how this rolls out. And if your last slide, had all the dots, and the dots were getting to be organized in subsectors and clumps, and you could see kind of like how the profile of different investment opportunities lay out within not only the middle sector, but you can push it all the way out to include your extremes as well. So it's really simply a question of capital and how we understand performance, and within each area you have different opportunities, you have different strategies that have different, you could call them trade-offs, but I view them as different levels of performance and return based on the allocation you're making. Does that make sense?
Yep,
So
absolutely.
I think we need to start with understanding that value is whole, capital is one, and then within that, the reason we get locked into this is that people have to then commit to a certain type of strategy. We're a fund, this is what we're going to return, this is what we're going to give you. And so as soon as we lock into those, we buy into this, this duplicity around that. There's difference, or what are the two of the arguments you're making is better. They're both the same arguments. It's simply about what it is that investors seek and the kind of capital performance that we're trying to generate, right? But you're all right. If you're looking at it from a portfolio, you're all good, right? It's all one conversation you're having. You're just like, you're taking each of your hammers and kind of whacking each other when you should be building the house. You know what I mean?
And that's what this. That's why it was. This whole presentation is about stopping the tug of war. That actually, that you start to get into the position where there are different parts of the market where people can say, and when we start to see transparency come, is when it will take years of some failures of some of the funds out there that were too aggressive about the impact they could create and the returns they could give, and then we're starting to see, well, who do they invest in, and oh, that was more difficult than actually we thought. We couldn't get those kind of returns, and we're going to, Acumen is going to stay at this side and think that we're picking people for this side, and it's great that there'll be other people on this side in this market, and if we're all transparent about it and say, here's what we understood about impact as much as we could, and here's what the returns were, we might start to see that some of these sectors start to appear in different parts of the market, and then people can be more honest about their investing strategies.
So I would actually disagree with a few things you said.
I bet.
One is that I don't think we should all come together and hammer the same house yet, and that's because I don't think we have enough data. When we have data, and when we get to that point of transparency, and we have data to address the problems, we should come together, because then we can agree on the solutions because we have data. When we don't have data, I think more disagreement in the sector is probably a good thing, because we're going to get more hypotheses out there to test, and that's healthy dialogue. If we all agree and we don't have any data, then the emperor's not wearing any clothes. The second thing I'd say is, I think you're blurring your lines a little bit there. Because when you say like venture capital, yes, there's a distribution of returns that's expected in any investment fund. But do we actually see that in investment funds that invest in for-profit social enterprises, that maybe they're targeting an overall return of 0 or 1% or 2%, that we're seeing a distribution, yes, all these lose money and a couple make a bunch of money, and then overall we get there, right? I don't know that we have enough data to say that, so I don't know if it's a fair comparison. At the end of the day, what really matters is how many investors are there out there who are willing to do the calculation about trade-offs for a certain amount of return to get a certain amount of value, and what's the market really going to bear? I think we're fooling ourselves if we believe that we can consistently offer but negative returns to lots of people to create social impact, and that money's just going to keep flowing in. I think if we consistently offer dead break even, maybe, but the market, there's not that, more capital's coming, but it's not huge. It's a fragment of what VC is in the world, and we need to be real about that.
All right, so I'm going to give the money guy is going to have the last word. Thank you guys very much. It's time for drinks.